Another song from somewhere else. This is chapter 2, part 2. Here we go. The kitchen door swung shut behind her. It was not a click, not locking her in anywhere, but it was a shush of air and a tiny clink of a metal latch against its partner in the door frame. And now a strip of underdoor light lit the top of the stairs. Franks felt the smooth walls with her hand as she edged down, feeling each step with the toe of her shoe. The stairs went straight down until they reached a little flat landing, where they turned to the side and continued on. A crystal shimmer of music, the swooping circle of it, was louder. Not loud, but nearer, closer. She could hear other things in it too. There was a sharp, hurtful noise, like a piano playing at the very highest point it could go. It scratched inside her ears. She had no doubt that she had to get closer to it, even while her stomach spoke sense and said, "Back upstairs, quick, before you get both in trouble." The music was its own whispered invitation, an invitation she felt bound to accept. It wasn't dark down there. As she crept around the corner, she saw the cellar was filled with light. Not bright light, not like stepping out into daylight, but an indoors light, a late night light. It almost flickered, and as it did, the music crackled, and as if it were recording that was beginning, as if it was a recording that was beginning to jump. She could make out the last few steps before her and tiptoed down them as she glanced around the room. For a moment, it looked like the sort of basement you read about in books or in films, piled with boxes and junk and old stuff. But then the cellar changed. It flickered like a candle. She saw something else. Through it. There's another room, she thought, somewhere else, but also here. It was brighter, neater, emptier. Light fell in this other room from tall windows. Fran heard the music swell, and she saw something move. There was a desk on the other side of the room, and something was sat there. It clicked buttons on an oversized keyboard with fat, long fingers. It was bigger than a man, bigger than anyone she'd ever seen. Not fat, but overgrown in all directions. It was hairless, or almost. It was a woman, perhaps. Flying robes like sheets fell from its shoulders, clasped there with a round gleaming brooch. It was grey and rocky looking. The word troll echoed in Frank's head, even though she hadn't believed in such things. She was a sensible girl, and hadn't believed in fairy tales and children's stories. "But you're glad you're not a goat all the same," said her stomach. "Yes," she replied gruffly. She saw this troll sat at its desk through the cellar she'd seen first. The box had gone. The boxes hadn't gone, hadn't disappeared, but they had become wispy, smoky, or maybe they stayed sharp and crisp, and it was the other room, the one with the desk and the light that was smoky. Either way, she could see through them like a misty window. It was hard to understand, hard to keep straight in her head. It was as if two places were trying to exist in the same place at the same time. Her feet felt as if they could break away, tiptoe up the stairs and get out of there before the thing at the desk turned round and saw her. But the music kept playing, calmed her heart, which should have been beating madly with fear. Touched her hot brow like a cool flannel held her hand almost. And the troll turned round and saw her. The music stopped dead with a click. Silence fell harder than Frank had ever heard it fall before. It took the wind out of her. Two tiny white eyes peered at her from a huge, flat, ugly, grey, stony face, sharp white pinpricks through the mist. Frank thought nothing. The troll stared at her, blinked, and then it said something. A voice like a landslide rumbled words she didn't understand, couldn't understand. It didn't roar at her, didn't growl. It didn't seem like a very good troll, not the sort you read about in books, the sort that tears people's arms off and eats their insides. It seemed to be almost friendly, the way it looked at her with those little eyes. It said something else, and Frank felt the words vibrate in her stomach. "I told you," her stomach said, feeling ever so slightly seasick. It didn't say what it had told her. And then, as Frank watched, as she considered stepping forward, as she contemplated taking a step towards the troll instead of away from it, the whole scene faded. The other room was gone, and all Frank was left with was the woody smell and the faint tinge of the music still curling around the hairs at the back of her neck. She took a deep breath, stood up straight. Be sensible, she said. She didn't believe in trolls, didn't believe in seeing things except normal things, didn't believe in things that disappeared. Nothing had just happened, she told herself, nothing. The basement was dark, dim, lit only by the light from a row of cobwebbed windows high up in the far side. Her heart echoed in the junk-crowded, shadow-cornered room. Something rubbed against her ankles. She looked down. There was nothing there. Just a draught, maybe, fluttering a bit of rag across the floor. "Frank," called a voice from upstairs. "Frank, where are you?" God, Frank thought, it's Nick. This wasn't my idea, her stomach said. He was going to be mad, going to be angry. How could she explain what she'd seen? How could she explain what she'd just done? You shouldn't sneak around other people's houses exploring cellars on your own. It just wasn't on. He had every right to be angry. Nick looked at her as she shut the door. She was more scared now than she'd been down there. In the cellar she'd hardly had time to think, but the climb up the stairs had been endless. Now her heart shook like a cat-rattled bird. "The toilet," she said. "Brilliant lie," her stomach said. Utterly convincing, except... "What?" Nick said. "I was looking for the toilet," she explained weakly. "It's in the hall," Nick said slowly. "Or there's one upstairs." "I didn't want to disturb you," Frank replied, pointing at the stair door. I saw the door and thought, oh no, she thought, that flappy stuttery. Look. Nick didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "What did you find?" Frank tried to think. What had she seen? Back in the kitchen with the warm summer light washing the terracotta tiled floor. What had happened in the cellar no longer seemed real. The back door was open. She could hear birds singing, a ball being kicked against a wall. Off in the distance, traffic coming. "No toilet," she said. "Just boxes and old stuff." Nick sighed. "Yeah, it's a bit of an old junk room," he said. "You should be careful. You could get lost down there." "But," she began and stopped. Nick was smiling. He seemed to have relaxed. He wasn't angry after all. The music was long gone. A door opened in the hallway. "Was that your gran, Nick?" Mr. Underbridge called. "Yeah." "How was she? What's new up there?" Frank looked at the cupboard doors where Nick and Dad spoke about family things. The cupboard doors weren't very interesting. Nick's dad had paint in his hands and paintbrushes in them. She thought of how she wore one of her dad's old shirts back to front to do art at school to keep her own shirt clean. Mr. Underbridge hadn't done that. He just had paint on his shirt, speckles and drips and splotches. But maybe it was one of his own old ones, or maybe he brought a new one for each new painting. Her head span. She sat down quickly. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes, fine," she said. "Thank you." "Are you going to stay for lunch?" "No," she said. "Dad's making lunch." "Something nice?" "No." Mr. Underbridge snorted a little laugh. "I'd best be off in a minute," she said, glancing at the clock. She went out the back door, which had been open all morning to let the fresh, clean summer air in, and turned. There was a couple of steps down on the little square patio. Nick stood huge in the doorway, looming over her. "We okay?" he asked. "Yeah, of course we are," she said. He nodded slowly. "You going to come back?" he asked. "Sure," she said. As she picked her bike up from the lawn where she'd dumped it earlier, she noticed a row of windows that ran on the bottom of the wall below the kitchen. Grass was growing in front of them, and she could see cobwebs. They weren't clean, but they looked into the cellar, as something had been real. She'd seen those windows from both sides now. She turned to look up at Nick again, smiling, and as she did, she could have sworn something like a shadow slipped out from amongst those cobwebs and slid into the garden. There we go. But it was just a movement in the corner of her eye. When she turned to look, there was nothing there. "Let's not come back," her stomach said. "Maybe I'll come back tomorrow," Frank replied. "Cool," said Nick. She pushed at the salad with a fork. "Did you have a good morning?" her dad asked. "It was okay," she said. "What did you do in the end?" "Went round Nick's, did some drawing and stuff." "That's nice," he said, shoving a massive salad leaf into his mouth and crunching wetly. Some people in this world are lettuce people, Frank thought, and some people simply aren't. She pushed the leaves around the plate until she uncovered a cube of salty cheese, speared it and popped it in her mouth. It wasn't very nice. She didn't need anyone to tell her that what she'd seen in the cellar, or what she thought she'd seen in the cellar, wasn't something to mention at home. Her mum and dad weren't the sort of people who believed in ghosts, trolls, or otherworldly things. They got embarrassed, shouting for continuous minimus from the back door. That's how ordinary they were. And although Frank herself didn't know what it was she'd seen, didn't know exactly what it meant, the image stayed sharp in front of her mind, fluttering around like a newspaper in the wind. It crackled and kept reminding herself of it. It didn't explain itself, but it didn't go away, not like a dream does when you've woken up, and that meant, she thought finally, it must have been real, whatever it was. Her dad's mobile phone buzzed on the table. He leant back in his chair and picked it up and looked at it. I don't know that number, he said, raising an eye at Frank, which was his way of saying curiouser and curiouser. He held it to his ear and said, hello? It continued buzzing. He lowered it, tapped the screen with his finger, then lifted it again and said, hello? A second time. Really? He said. Oh gosh, he said. What's the address? He said. Frank, not being an idiot, grabbed a pen and envelope from the sideboard and put it in front of him. He wrote down the address. Yes, in about half an hour, he said, and hung up. Is it continuous minimus? Frank asked. Yes, he said. Someone's found him. They picked Hector up from his friend's house. Frank sat in the front seat with the cat cage on her lap. It was empty, except for an old towel and some scattered biscuits in the bottom. He'll probably be hungry, she said. Hector strapped into the child seat in the back and was quite happy talking to his reflection in the car window. Frank's head buzzed. Not only was she 10 minutes away from being reunited with the best cat in the world, but the morning's events refused to stop turning and turning inside her head. It wasn't just the whole seeing things in the cellar business, but also the whole being friends with Nicholas Underbridge things as well. How had that happened? How had she let it happen? What would she say when Jess came back from holiday? Did she only like him because of the music that came from the ghost troll thing in his cellar? Or did she actually like him as a real friend, an ordinary one? It was perplexing, that's what it was. But now Quintinius Minimus was almost back. Maybe she'd understand better. There was something unbalanced about the world while he was missing. Something a bit squiffy. The car drew to a stop outside a white-panelled bungalow in a street of white-panelled bungalows. All the front gardens had matching neat rose beds in them. Frank had been watching the roads as they'd driven, and although they'd gone round a roundabout route, they weren't a terribly long way from where they lived. A fair way for a cat to walk, though. She followed her dad up onto the pavement, holding the cage in front of her. You stay here, Hector, her dad said. Guard the car for us. They walked up the path together, and Frank pressed the doorbell. Before the ding-dong had stopped echoing in the air, the door opened a crack. Mr. Patel, an old voice asked from inside. Frank could just make out a wisp of white hair, a smudge of painted pink cheek, a dark glint of an eye. Yes, we're here about the cat, her dad said. Frank held the cage up to the door. Mr. Patel? Yes, that's right, her dad repeated, and this is my daughter, Francesca. He put a hand on Frank's shoulder. It's her cat, really? I see. You can never be too careful. The door shut. Frank and her dad looked at each other. He raised an eyebrow. Frank giggled nervously. There was a noise from inside of metal jangling. The door opened again, slightly wider. He turned up at the weekend, said the old lady. Wouldn't go away. I had to share my sandwich. Tuna it was. Do you have tuna where you come from? It's a sort of fish. I'm a touch fond of it, and so is he. But I can't be sharing sandwiches at my time of life. And that's what I said to my Marjorie. That's my daughter. I hate to interrupt, her dad said, interrupting. But is the cat here? Frank's got some homework to be doing, and I've left some of the potatoes on the hob. We really have got to get going. Oh, said the old lady, who was slightly shocked. It was a meow from somewhere further inside the house, and Frank's heart sank. She let the cage slump in her arms. A cat that almost looked a little like Quintus Minimus, if you ignore this one's sleek, shiny coat and its bright green eyes, walked up the hall and rubbed its head on the old lady's bandaged ankles. Oh dear, said her dad. Yeah, Frank said. Oh, here he is, said the old lady, shuffling her feet away from the cat's nose. All yours. And don't worry about the reward. I mean, I've got my pension. I'll be fine. I'm afraid that's not our cat. They were silent in the car home. I'm sorry, Frank, her dad said, when he let her in the back door. She put the cage back under the stairs, and her dad gave her a hug, whether she wanted it or not. The next chapter is called Tuesday Night.